Rain has a way of making a school hallway sound like the inside of a drum, every footstep and every whisper bouncing off the tiled walls until you can't tell where one sound ends and another begins. That's the first thing I remember about the day everything changed. Not his face, not even his name, just the sound of water hammering against the windows while I stood frozen outside a classroom door that wasn't mine, holding a transfer slip that suddenly felt too heavy for my hands. I'm Jason Bliss. And until that morning, my life had been almost embarrassingly ordinary. New school, new city, new uniform that still smelled like the plastic wrapping it came in. I'd told myself the whole train ride over that I could handle a fresh start. I did not expect the fresh start to involve nearly getting my ribs introduced to a wall by 3 second years who didn't like the way I'd apparently looked at them in the cafeteria line. I hadn't looked at them at all. I'd been staring at a tray of gray mystery meat, silently mourning my life choices, when a shoulder had slammed into mine hard enough to spill juice down my sleeve. I said sorry out of pure reflex, the kind of apology that leaves your mouth before you've even processed what happened. And that, apparently, was the wrong move. Around here, sorry from the new kid sounded like a challenge. They'd cornered me by the stairwell after class, all three of them, backs to the door so I couldn't slip past. I remember thinking, with the strange, detached calm that fear sometimes gives you, that I should have paid better attention to which hallways were considered safe by the seniors who'd been assigned to show me around. And then the air changed. I don't know how else to describe it. 1 second, the tallest one had his hand fisted in my collar, and the next second, he wasn't touching me anymore. Because he was too busy staring past my shoulder like he'd seen something that turned his blood to ice water. I turned around. Raphael Oliver was leaning against the stairwell wall like he'd been there the whole time, arms crossed, dark hair damp from the rain, expression so flat and unreadable that it somehow managed to be louder than any shout. He didn't say a single word. He just looked at the three of them, one at a time, slow, like he was deciding something, and by the time his eyes reached the last boy, all three had already backed up 2 full steps. "We were just talking," the tall one said. His voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. Raphael didn't answer. He pushed off the wall, walked past them without so much as brushing a shoulder against anyone, and stopped in front of me. Up close, he was taller than he'd looked from a distance, with a small white scar through one eyebrow and eyes the color of wet asphalt, the kind of eyes that made you feel like you were being read rather than looked at. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which felt so wrong next to everything I'd just heard about him that I didn't know how to respond. I touched my lip. My fingers came away red. I hadn't even noticed the tall one's ring catching my mouth when he'd shoved me. Raphael didn't wait for me to answer. He just turned his head slightly toward the 3 boys still frozen by the stairs and said, without raising his voice at all, "Don't let me see this again." They didn't argue. They didn't even look at me on their way out. That was the first time I understood, in the smallest possible way, what it meant for someone to be the person that an entire school was afraid of. I would spend the rest of the semester learning exactly how afraid, and exactly why none of it had anything to do with the reasons I expected. His name had reached me before he had. Raphael Oliver, 2nd year, transferred in himself 2 years back under circumstances nobody would explain clearly, expelled once from another school, though the story of why changed depending on who told it. Some said he'd put a senior in the hospital. Some said he ran a group that handled problems for a price. Some said if you made eye contact with him for too long in the hallway, you'd wake up with your locker glued shut the next morning, just as a warning. None of it matched the boy who'd looked at my split lip like it personally offended him. I didn't expect to see him again outside of hallway gossip, honestly. I figured whatever had happened in that stairwell was a fluke. Maybe he'd simply been bored. Or maybe those 3 had wronged him personally once, and my scuffle with them had been convenient collateral. I told myself that story for exactly 4 days, until Thursday, when I found him sitting on the low wall outside the school gate after last period, clearly waiting, clearly for no one but me. "You walk home the long way," he said, when I stopped in front of him, too surprised to keep moving. "How would you know that?" "Because the short way goes past the vending machines where those 3 like to loiter." He stood, slinging his bag over one shoulder, and started walking before I'd even agreed to anything. "I'm taking the long way today." I don't know why I fell into step beside him instead of asking 100 reasonable questions. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange, unearned safety that came from walking next to someone every other student visibly flinched away from. Whatever the reason, that walk became the first of many, and within 2 weeks, it had turned into something I looked forward to without admitting it to myself. He didn't talk much on those walks, not at first. He'd ask short questions. What I'd eaten for lunch, whether my new locker combination had finally clicked in my memory, whether the rain the night before had leaked through my window like it apparently leaked through half the dorm building. Small things, human things, nothing like the rumors. It was on one of those quiet walks, maybe 3 weeks in, that I finally asked him directly why he'd stepped in that first day. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, without looking at me, "Because you apologized to someone who was hurting you. That's not something people should get punished for." I didn't have a response to that. I still don't think I do. The weeks between that first walk and the incident with Desmond weren't empty ones, even if I've compressed them here into a handful of scenes. There were dozens of small, ordinary afternoons that mattered just as much, maybe more, because they were the ones that taught me who Raphael actually was underneath the reputation, one quiet detail at a time. There was the day he showed up to our walk with a bandage wrapped clumsily around his knuckles, and when I asked what happened, he just shrugged and said he'd tripped. And it wasn't until 3 days later that I heard from someone else entirely that he'd put his hand through a vending machine that had eaten a first year's lunch money and then refused to give it back even after the kid cried about it. He never would have told me that part himself. He didn't think it was worth mentioning, the way other people might mention buying someone a coffee. There was the rainy afternoon in April when I forgot my umbrella and expected to get soaked on the walk home, only to find him already waiting with 2 umbrellas instead of 1. Like he'd noticed the forecast and thought of me before I'd even thought of myself. I asked him, half joking, if he always carried a spare. He said no, not always. Just since he started noticing, I never remembered mine. There was the day I found him sitting alone on the back stairwell during lunch, headphones in, eyes closed, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. I almost turned around, worried I was intruding on something private, but he opened his eyes before I could retreat and patted the step beside him without a word. We sat there in silence for the entire period, his shoulder against mine, and it was one of the most comfortable silences I'd ever shared with another person. I didn't understand yet how rare that kind of ease was for him, how few people he let close enough to share silence with instead of performance. And there was the evening, maybe 2 weeks before Desmond first cornered me when he walked me all the way to my dorm building instead of stopping at the usual fork in the road, and stood there afterward like he wasn't sure how to make himself leave. "You could just say goodnight," I told him, laughing a little at how he lingered. He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes, and said, "I know, I like doing it anyway." At the time, I told myself it didn't mean anything beyond simple friendliness. Looking back, I think some part of me already suspected otherwise and simply wasn't ready to name it. It was during this same stretch that I first met his mother, entirely by accident, on a Saturday when I'd tagged along to help him carry groceries, because he'd mentioned, offhand, that his arm was sore from a practice match. She was a small, quick-eyed woman who took one look at me standing awkwardly in their kitchen doorway and said, without any preamble at all, "So you're the one he won't stop talking about." Raphael had gone the color of a tomato and insisted too quickly that he did not talk about me constantly, which only made her laugh harder and made me feel for the first time since arriving in this city, like I'd stumbled into somewhere I might actually belong. By the start of the second month, it wasn't a secret walk anymore. It was a known thing, an accepted fact of the ecosystem of our school. The same way everyone knew which vending machine ate your coins and which teacher gave detention for gum. Jason Bliss walks with Raphael Oliver. Jason Bliss is, by some invisible extension, untouchable. I hated how much I liked that. Not the untouchable part, the part where it was him. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being the new kid in a place where everyone else has years of shared history, inside jokes you'll never catch up on, friendships that started in elementary school and calcified into something unbreakable. I'd been drowning quietly in that particular loneliness since the day I arrived, smiling through lunch periods where I sat 2 seats away from actual conversations instead of inside them, and then without asking for it, without doing anything to deserve it, I had this someone who waited by the gate, who noticed which way I walked, who somehow made the whole aching weight of being new feel lighter just by existing near me. It scared me a little, how much I'd started organizing my day around the hope of seeing him. The incident that made me understand how far he was actually willing to go happened on a Wednesday in May, the kind of gray, humid afternoon that makes uniforms stick to your back. I was walking to the library alone. Raphael had a meeting with a homeroom teacher he'd been avoiding, when I ran into a boy named Desmond, a third year with a reputation of his own, though his was built on charm instead of fear. He was popular in the way that made teachers overlook things. He cornered me by the library entrance, not violently, not at first, just close enough that it felt wrong. One arm braced against the wall beside my head, voice pitched low and syrupy. "You're the one Oliver's been walking around with," he said, like it was an opening line in some game only he understood the rules to. "I'm curious what that's about." I told him it wasn't about anything, that Raphael was just a friend, and I tried to duck under his arm to leave. He didn't let me. His hand caught my wrist, not hard, but firm enough that panic started climbing up my throat in that fast, ugly way it does when your body understands danger before your mind fully catches up. "Let go," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. I don't know how Raphael found out. I've asked him since, more than once, and he's never given me a straight answer, just a small, private smile that tells me it's a secret he intends to keep forever. What I do know is that less than 2 minutes later, he was there, and the temperature of the entire hallway dropped 10 degrees. He didn't shout. He didn't even move quickly. He simply walked over, peeled Desmond's fingers off my wrist one at a time, like he was diffusing something delicate, and said in a voice so calm it was somehow more frightening than yelling would have been, "You don't touch him." Desmond, to his credit, tried to laugh it off, tried to make some comment about how he didn't realize Oliver had gotten possessive over a first year. Raphael didn't answer the taunt. He just kept his eyes on Desmond's face, unblinking, until the older boy's smile faltered and died on its own, and he walked away without another word. When it was just the two of us in the hallway, Raphael turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something that looked almost like fear cross his features. Not fear of Desmond, not fear of any fight, fear of what he'd almost let happen. "Are you okay?" he asked. His hand hovered near my wrist without touching it, like he needed permission first. "I'm fine," I said, though my pulse hadn't slowed down yet. "I should have walked you here. You can't walk me everywhere, Raphael." He looked at me like that was exactly the wrong thing to say, like it was a challenge instead of a fact, and something in his jaw tightened. "Maybe I can't. Does it mean I don't want to?" I didn't know what to do with a sentence like that. I still don't think I fully processed it until hours later, lying awake in my dorm room, replaying the low certainty in his voice until it looped into something that felt dangerously close to hope. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. I started noticing things after that, small patterns I'd been too distracted to catch before. Raphael's reputation, the fights, the reasons other students crossed the hallway rather than walk near him, none of it, as far as I could tell, ever started with him. Every single story I eventually pieced together, through overheard conversations and the occasional careful question, ended the same way. Someone had hurt someone smaller, someone quieter, someone who couldn't defend themselves, and Raphael had ended it, usually without throwing the first punch, sometimes without throwing any punch at all. His fear factor wasn't built on cruelty. It was built on the absolute certainty that if you crossed a line with someone weaker than you, he would be the consequence. I asked him about it once, on a rooftop we'd started sneaking up to during lunch. The kind of place where the wind was loud enough to make conversations feel private even in a school of 600 students. Why do you do it? I asked. The fighting, the reputation, you could just not. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the field below us, hands loose in his lap. There was someone, he said finally, before I transferred here. A friend, younger than me. He got hurt, badly, by people who thought no one would step in because no one ever had before. His jaw tightened, the way it did whenever a memory cost him something. I wasn't there in time. By the time I was, it didn't matter what I did to the people who hurt him. It didn't undo it. I didn't say anything. I didn't think there was anything to say that wouldn't feel small next to what he just handed me. So now, he continued, quieter, if I see it happening, if I even suspect it's about to happen, I stop it before it becomes something I can't undo. That's all this is. It was never about being feared. I don't actually care if people are scared of me. I care that they stop before someone else ends up like he did. What happened to him? I asked, even though some instinct told me I might not want the answer. He's alive, Raphael said, but he's not the same. Some things don't heal the way people expect them to. He looked over at me then, something unbearably soft moving behind the flat asphalt color of his eyes. That's why the first day, in the stairwell, when I saw you and you were apologizing to people who were about to hurt you anyway, I couldn't just watch it happen again. I understood, in that moment, that everything people whispered about him in the hallways, the fear, the myth, the danger, was a costume built over something much softer and much sadder than any of them realized. And I understood with a kind of quiet devastation that I had started to care about the boy underneath that costume far more than was safe for someone who still didn't know if his feelings were returned. After that rooftop conversation, something between us shifted, subtly but unmistakably. He started telling me things he clearly hadn't told many people before. Not dramatic confessions, just small, honest fragments, offered the way you might hand someone something fragile and watch to see how carefully they held it. He told me his father had left when he was 9, and that his mother had worked 2 jobs for years afterward without ever once complaining in front of him. Though he'd hear her crying quietly through the wall some nights when she thought he was asleep. He told me he'd started fighting originally not out of anger but out of a desperate need to feel like he had control over something, anything, in a life that had felt entirely out of his hands since the day his father's car pulled out of the driveway for the last time. He told me, too, about the friend from before, more details this time, offered slowly over several different afternoons rather than all at once, like he was testing how much weight I could hold before adding more. His name had been Sammy. They'd grown up 2 houses apart, inseparable in the specific, uncomplicated way only childhood friendships manage, before everything changed the year they turned 14. Sammy had been small for his age, gentle in a way that certain kinds of boys mistake for weakness. And there had been a group at their old school who'd made a project out of tormenting him for almost a full year before anyone with any real power stepped in. I knew, Raphael admitted to me one evening, voice low, eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder like the memory was easier to hold if he wasn't looking directly at me while he handed it over. I knew it was getting worse. He kept telling me it was fine, that he could handle it, and I believed him because it was easier than admitting how bad it actually was. By the time I understood how bad it actually was, it was already too late to stop the worst of it. I asked him carefully what had happened, and he shook his head, not unkindly, just firmly. That part isn't mine to tell. It's his. Someday, if you ever meet him, maybe he'll tell you himself. What matters is that afterward, I promised myself I'd never again wait for someone to tell me they could handle something before I stepped in. I decided I'd rather be wrong 100 times, rather look overprotective or dramatic or whatever people wanted to call it, than ever again wait too long, because I was trying to respect someone's pride over their safety. It was a strange kind of gift, hearing all of this, being trusted with the actual architecture of his fear instead of just its outward shape. I found myself wanting, more and more, to be someone worth that kind of trust, someone who wouldn't flinch away from the weight of it. We spent most evenings that spring in some version of that same closeness, sometimes on the rooftop, sometimes at the small noodle shop 2 streets from the school where the owner had started setting out a second cup of tea the moment she saw either of us walk in alone, assuming correctly that the other would follow within minutes. We talked about small things and enormous things in the same breath, the way you do with someone once the initial performance of getting to know each other has worn away and what's left is just two people who genuinely want to understand one another. I think, if I'm honest, I fell in love with him slowly across dozens of these unremarkable evenings rather than in any single dramatic moment. By the time Theo sat down at our lunch table for the first time in early June, I was already so far gone that the jealousy in Raphael's shoulders when it appeared felt less like a surprise and more like the final confirmation of something I'd suspected for weeks. Summer crept in slow that year, turning the afternoons gold and thick with cicada noise, and somewhere in the stretch between May and June, I stopped pretending to myself that what I felt for Raphael was ordinary gratitude. It had turned into something with roots, something that ached pleasantly in my chest every time he showed up at the gate a minute early, every time he remembered some offhand detail I'd mentioned once in passing weeks before. Every time his hand brushed mine while we walked and neither of us moved away. I hadn't said anything, neither had he. We existed in that particular unspoken place where both people know something is happening, but neither wants to be the one who names it first, in case naming it breaks whatever fragile, precious thing is holding it together. It was a boy named Theo who eventually forced the issue, without meaning to. Theo was a first year like me, soft-spoken, easily flustered, the kind of person who made friends by simply refusing to be unkind to anyone. He'd started sitting with us at lunch sometimes, mostly because he had nowhere else to sit, and Raphael, despite his reputation, never once turned anyone away from our table. Theo liked me. Not in any dramatic way, he just liked spending time with me, laughed easily at things I said, sat a little closer than strictly necessary. I hadn't thought much of it. Raphael had thought about it plenty. I noticed it first as a kind of stiffness in his shoulders whenever Theo sat down across from us, a shortness in his answers that wasn't like him. I noticed it more when Theo asked if I wanted to study together after school one Friday, and Raphael, without looking up from his food, said, "He's busy," before I'd even had the chance to answer for myself. I was too surprised to be annoyed in the moment. It was only later, walking home with him in unusually thick silence, that I finally asked what that had been about. "Nothing," he said, which was answer enough by itself because Raphael never said nothing unless something very much was going on. "You don't get to answer for me," I said. My voice came out sharper than I meant it to, mostly because I was still trying to understand my own reaction, the strange, guilty thrill under the annoyance, the part of me that hadn't hated being claimed like that even as I resented the way he'd done it. He stopped walking. When I turned back to look at him, his expression had cracked open in a way I'd never seen before, something raw and almost embarrassed showing through the usual stillness. "I know I don't," he said. He stopped, jaw working, like the words were fighting him on the way out. "I don't like watching him look at you like that." "Like what?" "Like he's allowed to." The air between us went very quiet. Somewhere behind us, cicadas kept screaming into the heat, indifferent to the fact that my entire world had just tilted several degrees on its axis. "And you think you're allowed to?" I asked, because some reckless, hopeful part of me needed to hear him answer honestly. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quiet, almost too quiet to catch over the insects, "I don't know. I want to be. I've wanted to be since the stairwell, and it's gotten so much worse since then that I don't know how to keep pretending it's just protectiveness." I felt my heart do something complicated and enormous in my chest. "Raphael." "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, already backing off, already retreating behind the careful walls he usually kept up. "Forget I said it. I shouldn't have." "I don't want to forget it," I said. He looked at me like he hadn't expected that, like some part of him had been so braced for rejection that acceptance hadn't registered as a real possibility. "I've wanted you to be allowed since the stairwell too," I admitted, the words tumbling out clumsy and unpolished because I hadn't planned this confession. Hadn't rehearsed it the way I imagined I would if I ever got the courage. I just didn't think someone like you would want someone like me. Someone like you, he repeated, something almost like disbelief in his voice, is the only person who's made me feel like the version of myself I actually want to be, instead of the one everyone's scared of. He took a step closer, slow, careful, like he was giving me every chance to step back if I needed to. I didn't. Jason, I don't know how to say this without sounding insane, but I think I've been in love with you since before I understood what that meant. I don't remember deciding to close the distance between us. I just remember that 1 second there was space and the next there wasn't. And his hand came up to rest against my jaw with a gentleness that felt almost unbearable given everything I'd heard about him before I actually knew him. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, like neither of us quite believed it was happening, and then steadier, surer, full of every unspoken week that had led us here. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, breathing unsteady in a way that made something in my chest ache with tenderness. I've been wanting to do that since the stairwell, he admitted. You could have done it sooner. I was scared, he said. And it was such a strange, vulnerable thing to hear from someone the entire school was afraid of, that I almost laughed. Except the moment was too soft for laughter, too fragile and important. Of what? Of you saying no. Of ruining the only good thing I had going, which was just walking home with you. I reached up and covered the hand still resting against my jaw with my own. You're not going to ruin it, I said. You're the best thing that's happened to me since I got here. He smiled, then an actual full smile, rare enough that I felt privileged just to witness it, and something in his whole posture softened in a way I'd never seen from him before. Like a held breath, finally releasing after months of tension. The days right after that kiss existed in a strange, golden haze I still find difficult to describe fully. Everything felt sharper and softer at once, the walk to school more vivid, the ordinary chatter of the hallways somehow warmer. Like the whole world had shifted half a degree toward kindness simply because I now got to reach for his hand without hesitation. We didn't announce anything. We didn't need to. It simply became true, the way certain facts about a person become true, the moment you stop questioning them. The sky is blue. The tea at the noodle shop is too hot to drink right away. Raphael Oliver is mine, and I am his. He walked me to class some mornings, an entirely unnecessary detour given that his homeroom was in the opposite wing, and when I pointed this out, he just shrugged and said the extra 10 minutes were worth it. He started leaving small things in my bag without mentioning it. A spare pen when mine ran out during an exam. A strip of cough drops during the 1 week I came down with a cold. A folded note once that just said in surprisingly careful handwriting for someone with such a reputation, made it through the day without a single fight entirely for your benefit. Please be impressed. I kept that note. I still have it, tucked into the same drawer where I keep the ticket stub from the first movie we ever saved up to see together. His mother, when she found out officially rather than simply suspecting it, cried a little, which embarrassed Raphael terribly and moved me more than I expected. She hugged me for a long moment in the kitchen doorway and told me quietly that she hadn't seen her son smile the way he'd been smiling for months, not since long before they'd moved to this city, and that whatever I was doing, she hoped I intended to keep doing it. I told her I did. I meant it completely. Word got around fast after that, the way it always does in schools where everyone is starving for something to talk about. Jason Bliss and Raphael Oliver. Together. Not just walking, not just protected, but together in the way people meant when they lowered their voices and exchanged glances across the cafeteria. Most people were too intimidated to say anything directly to either of us. A few weren't. Desmond, predictably, was one of the ones who couldn't help himself. He caught me alone again near the end of June, this time not by the library but outside the gym after practice let out, when the halls were mostly empty and the light through the windows had gone thin and orange. He wasn't cruel about it, not exactly. His voice was still all charm and easy confidence, but there was an edge underneath it that made my skin prickle. So it's true, he said, leaning against the wall in a way that blocked half the hallway. The delinquent's got himself a boyfriend. Don't call him that, I said, surprising myself with how firm it came out. What, delinquent? Everyone calls him that. He has a name. Desmond studied me for a moment, something calculating behind his eyes. You know he's not going to be able to protect you forever, right? Eventually, you're going to be somewhere he isn't, and someone's going to remember that hurting you is the easiest way to hurt him. The words landed somewhere cold in my stomach, mostly because some quiet, anxious part of me had already thought the same thing more than once late at night, when the fear of being a liability instead of a partner crept in uninvited. Is that a threat? I asked. It's a fact, he said, straightening up, some of the charm dropping away to reveal something colder underneath. People like Oliver make enemies. You're just the easiest place for those enemies to land. He left before I could respond, and I stood there in the empty hallway for a long moment, the orange light turning duller by the second, trying to talk myself out of the fear settling into my chest like sediment at the bottom of a glass. I didn't tell Raphael right away. I told myself it was because I didn't want to worry him over nothing, though. If I'm honest, some part of me was scared of what he might do if he knew Desmond had cornered me twice now. Scared of watching him become the version of himself he'd told me he didn't want to be anymore. I should have told him sooner. That mistake nearly cost us both more than I was prepared to pay. It happened on a night in early July, 3 days before the end of the term, during the kind of humid dark that makes even familiar streets feel foreign. I'd stayed late at the school library, finishing an assignment later than I meant to, and by the time I left, the halls were empty, and the sky outside had gone the deep purple-black of a summer storm, building somewhere just out of sight. Raphael had a family obligation that night, something with his mother he'd mentioned only briefly, enough that I knew not to expect him at the gate. I told myself the walk home would be fine. I'd made it 100 times before, even without him. I didn't make it home that night. They were waiting near the old bus stop 3 blocks from the dorms, 4 of them faces. I didn't fully recognize in the dark until one of them stepped forward and I realized, with a sick lurch, that Desmond was among them, though he hung back at the edges this time, letting the others do what he'd clearly arranged. Oliver's not here to save you now, one of them said, and the fear that had been building in my chest since Desmond's warning finally boiled over into something sharper, something closer to panic. I don't remember every detail of what happened next with perfect clarity. Fear has a way of scrambling memory, leaving gaps where the worst moments should be. I remember a shove that sent me stumbling against the bus stop's metal frame, pain blooming sharp along my shoulder. I remember trying to explain that I wasn't worth whatever they thought they were owed, that hurting me wouldn't accomplish anything, and I remember how none of it mattered, because they hadn't come to listen. I remember, more than anything, the sound of running footsteps against wet pavement, fast and furious, and then Raphael's voice, raw in a way I'd never heard before, cutting through the dark like something breaking. What happened after that is clearer, because it burned itself into memory with a kind of violent permanence. Raphael didn't hesitate the way he usually did, didn't give warnings or wait for anyone to back down first. He moved like something unleashed, and within seconds, 2 of the 4 were on the ground, and the other 2 were backing away with their hands up, finally understanding the difference between the version of him that gave people a chance and the version of him that showed up to find someone he loved already hurt. Desmond tried to run. Raphael caught his arm before he made it 3 steps and slammed him against the same metal frame I'd been shoved into minutes earlier, close enough that I could see Desmond's confidence, finally, completely collapse. "If you ever come near him again," Raphael said, voice low and shaking with something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief, "I promise you, there won't be enough of you left for anyone to recognize." Raphael. My voice came out smaller than I wanted, but it was enough. He turned, and whatever had taken over him in that moment cracked the second his eyes landed on me, replaced instantly by something closer to devastation. He released Desmond, who scrambled away without another word, dragging the others with him, and crossed the distance between us in 3 long strides, hands hovering over my shoulders like he was afraid touching me might hurt me further. "Are you hurt?" His voice had gone soft again, but underneath it was a tremor I'd never heard from him before. "Jason, look at me! Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," I said, though my shoulder throbbed and my hands wouldn't quite stop shaking. "I'm okay, Raphael, I promise." He pulled me into him then, careful of my shoulder, holding on like he was trying to convince his own body that I was actually solid and actually safe. I felt him shaking too, felt the uneven rhythm of his breathing against my hair, and understood, with sudden clarity, how much fear he must have carried the entire run over here, not knowing what he'd find. "I should have told you," I said into his chest. "Desmond warned me weeks ago. I didn't want you to. I didn't want you to become someone you didn't want to be, over me. Over me." He pulled back just enough to look at me, hands framing my face with a tenderness that contradicted everything that had just happened moments before. "Jason, there is no version of me that doesn't become this, if it means keeping you safe. You have to tell me these things, please. I can't do the thing that happened before again. I can't be too late again." I understood, finally, the full shape of what he'd been carrying since before I even knew him. The friend he hadn't reached in time, the guilt that had built his entire reputation out of the wreckage of that failure. I understood that tonight had, in some small and terrifying way, dredged all of it back up to the surface. "You weren't too late," I said, holding his face the way he held mine. "You got here, that's what matters. You got here." He kissed my forehead, then my temple, then finally my mouth, slow and shaking and grateful, like he needed the physical proof that I was still here to believe it fully. "I'm taking you to get that shoulder looked at," he said finally, voice steadier now. "And then we're talking, really talking, no more keeping things from me because you're scared of what I'll do." "Okay," I said, really talking. The nurse at the campus clinic said my shoulder was bruised badly but not fractured, a small miracle given how hard I'd hit that metal frame. Raphael sat beside the exam table the entire time, jaw tight, hand wrapped around mine like he needed the anchor as much as I did, and didn't relax until the nurse confirmed there was nothing worse waiting beneath the bruising. We sat outside the clinic afterward on a bench under a street lamp that flickered every few seconds like it couldn't quite decide whether to work, and talked in a way we hadn't let ourselves before, not about small, safe things, but about the actual fear underneath everything. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd been 10 minutes later," Raphael said, staring at his hands. "I keep thinking about him, my friend, from before, and how by the time I got there, it was already too late to matter." Tonight felt like that all over again, for about 30 seconds, before I saw you standing there. "But you weren't too late," I said again, because it felt important that he actually hear it, not just acknowledge it. "And I'm not going anywhere, Raphael. Not because of Desmond, not because of anyone like him." "I know that logically," he admitted, "but some part of me is always going to be a little afraid of losing you the same way I lost him. I don't know if that fear ever fully goes away." "Then we carry it together," I said. "You don't have to be afraid alone anymore. That's not what this is supposed to be." He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, some old weight easing just slightly, like my words had given him permission to set part of it down. "I love you," he said, quiet, certain, like it was the truest thing he'd ever said. "I don't think I've told you that plainly yet. I love you, Jason Bliss, and I'm sorry it took almost losing you tonight to say it clearly." "I love you too," I said, and I felt the words settle into place like something that had been waiting its whole life to be spoken. "You've had my heart since the stairwell, you just didn't know it yet." He laughed then, soft and a little wet, and pulled me carefully into his side, mindful of my bruised shoulder, and we sat there under the flickering street lamp until the storm that had been building all evening finally broke. Rain coming down in warm summer sheets, while we stayed exactly where we were unwilling to let the moment end. We didn't go home right away. Even after the worst of the rain passed, we stayed on that bench a while longer, my head resting against his shoulder, his fingers tracing slow, absent patterns against the back of my hand. both of us reluctant to let the fragile honesty of that night dissolve back into ordinary silence. At some point, he asked quietly if I wanted to talk about what had actually happened at the bus stop, not the fight itself, but the fear. The specific helplessness of being cornered by people who'd decided in advance that I didn't matter enough to warrant restraint. I told him more than I meant to, in the end. I told him how it had felt to realize no one was coming, how quickly my mind had gone from panic to a strange, resigned calm. The kind that convinces you bracing for pain is more useful than hoping for rescue. I told him I hated how instinctive that resignation had felt, like some old, practiced muscle memory from years of learning not to expect anyone to step in on my behalf. He didn't try to fix that feeling with reassurance the way some people might have. He just listened, quiet and attentive, and when I finished, he said, "You don't have to brace like that anymore, not with me here. I know that's not something I can just say once and have you believe it completely. Trust like that takes time to rebuild once it's been worn down. But I intend to spend as long as it takes proving it." It was such a plain, unadorned promise, and somehow that plainness made it land harder than anything more poetic could have. I believed him. Not instantly, not in some magical wound-healing instant, but in the slow, accumulating way that trust actually works. One more kept promise stacked on top of the last, until eventually the weight of all of them together is enough to hold you up. The following days were quieter than I expected, given everything that had happened. Raphael checked on me constantly without smothering me. A text before first period, a look across the classroom during the ones we shared, a hand finding mine during lunch like he needed the periodic confirmation that I was still there and still safe. His mother, when she heard what happened, insisted I come for dinner twice that week instead of once, feeding me until I could barely move and fussing over my shoulder with an intensity that made Raphael visibly embarrassed and made me quietly want to cry from how looked after I suddenly felt. I met Sammy for the first time near the end of that same week, almost by accident. Raphael had mentioned carefully that his old friend sometimes visited the city to see his grandmother, and that if I ever wanted to meet him, he'd like that. But only if I felt ready for whatever that conversation might bring up. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, mostly because I wanted to understand the shape of the grief Raphael carried, not just hear about it secondhand. Sammy turned out to be gentle in exactly the way Raphael had described, soft-spoken, quick to smile, despite whatever history lived behind his eyes. He didn't go into detail about what had happened to him, and I didn't ask him to. Instead, over milk tea at a small shop near the train station, he told me something I don't think I'll ever forget. He blames himself for not being fast enough, Sammy said, glancing toward the door like he expected Raphael to walk back in from the restroom any second and catch him saying it. But he doesn't understand that he was the only person who ever tried at all. Everyone else looked away. He didn't. That matters more than he lets himself believe. He wrapped both hands around his cup, thoughtful. I'm glad he found someone who makes him feel like that's enough. He deserves to stop punishing himself for something that was never fully his to prevent. I didn't tell Raphael everything Sammy said that day, not because I was keeping secrets, but because some things are better shown slowly through actions than delivered all at once as information. Instead, over the following weeks, I made a quiet, deliberate effort to remind him in small ways that he'd already done enough, that his worth wasn't measured only in the moments he managed to prevent harm, but in the simple, steady fact of how he showed up over and over for the people he loved. The end of that term brought consequences for Desmond and the others. Expulsion for 2 of them, suspension, and a formal warning for Desmond himself, whose family connections weren't quite enough to erase what 4 witnesses and a very thorough security camera near the bus stop had captured. Raphael, to my surprise and quiet relief, faced no serious consequences of his own. The same footage that convicted the others showed clearly enough that he'd acted only after finding me already hurt, defending rather than initiating. It didn't erase his reputation, not entirely. Some rumors are too deeply rooted to pull out in a single season, but something about the way people looked at him afterward shifted. Less pure fear. More of something like respect, tinged with the understanding that whatever made him frightening was inseparable from what made him protective, and that the two had never actually been in conflict the way everyone assumed. Summer break came and went in a blur of stolen afternoons, rooftop lunches that turned into rooftop evenings, walks that no longer needed an excuse, quiet hours spent at his family's apartment where his mother, once she understood who I was, to him started leaving an extra place setting at dinner without being asked. I learned things about him in that stretch of warm, unhurried time that the rumors never could have told me. That he hummed under his breath when he cooked off-key, and unaware of it that he kept a small, worn photograph of his childhood friend tucked into the back pocket of an old wallet, a reminder he carried, rather than hid, that he cried quiet and, without shame, the first time I told him some of my own history. The loneliness that had followed me from my old school to this one. The reason I'd apologized so readily to the boys who cornered me that very first day. By the time the new term began in September, we weren't a secret anymore, weren't even really a topic of gossip so much as an accepted fact. The way any established thing eventually becomes background rather than spectacle. Theo, it turned out, took the news with easy grace, admitting with a sheepish laugh that he'd suspected as much for weeks, and had mostly just enjoyed watching Raphael get flustered about it. There were still fights, occasionally. Raphael's reputation didn't disappear overnight, and there would always be some new student testing boundaries, some old grudge resurfacing. But something had changed in how he carried it. He no longer fought like a person trying to outrun a failure from years ago. He fought, when he had to, like someone protecting a life he'd finally let himself believe he deserved to be part of. There was one incident, in October of that new term, that I think about often, because it showed me exactly how much had shifted in him since summer. A second year I barely knew. A quiet boy named Marcus, who kept mostly to himself, got cornered near the equipment shed by a group of older students looking for an easy target. Raphael was the one who found them, as usual, and I watched from a distance, close enough to see but not to hear, as he stepped between Marcus and the group without a single raised fist. He talked to them. Actually talked, calm and level, for almost 2 full minutes, and by the end of it, the group had dispersed on their own, shamefaced, without a single blow being thrown. I asked him about it afterward, curious what had changed, and he just shrugged, a little sheepish. I used to think the only way to make people listen was to make them scared enough that words didn't matter, he said. But you taught me that fear isn't actually the point. Protecting someone is the point. If I can get the same result without needing my fists, that's better for everyone, including me. He looked over at me, something soft and a little shy crossing his features. I don't want Marcus growing up thinking the only lesson from tonight is how much violence it takes to feel safe. I'd rather he remember that someone simply refused to let it happen, and that was enough. I fell in love with him a little more in that moment, if that was even still possible by then. Winter arrived with its usual short days and long cold evenings, and our routines simply expanded to hold the season. Hot drinks from the vending machine that no longer ate anyone's coins. Since Raphael had personally seen to that after the incident in spring walks home, made shorter by the cold, but somehow warmer in every way that mattered. Evenings at his mother's apartment that had become so regular, I'd started keeping a spare change of clothes in the hall closet without either of us ever formally deciding that should happen. Theo by then had become a genuine friend to both of us, rather than an accidental source of tension. And he liked to tease Raphael mercilessly about the vending machine incident, calling him the reformed menace of the East hallway, until Raphael threatened with visible affection rather than any real irritation to reintroduce him to the equipment shed personally. Desmond transferred schools that winter, something about a fresh start his parents had decided was necessary, and though I never wished him particular ill will, I can't say I was sorry to see him go. Some chapters simply need to close before the next one can properly begin. By the time spring came around again, a full year after that first rainy stairwell morning, the anniversary of it had become something we marked quietly, just between the two of us. A small tradition neither of us had planned, but both of us protected fiercely once it started. We went back to that same stairwell on the exact date, stood in the exact spot, and Raphael brought 2 umbrellas, even though the forecast that year predicted clear skies, just because it had become our thing. The specific and slightly absurd ritual that belonged only to us. You know, I told him, leaning against the same wall where I'd once stood frozen and bleeding, if you told me a year ago that the scariest person in school would become the softest person I know, I wouldn't have believed you. I'm not soft, he said, mock offended, though the smile pulling at his mouth undercut the protest completely. You cried during that documentary about penguins last week. That was a very emotional documentary, Jason. You threatened a vending machine on behalf of a stranger's lunch money. That machine had it coming. I laughed and he pulled me in close, resting his chin against the top of my head the way he'd started doing sometime during winter, and for a long moment we just stood there in the quiet stairwell, breathing in the same recycled school air that had smelled a year ago like fear and rain and uncertainty, and now smelled like something closer to home. Thank you, I said eventually, muffled slightly against his chest. For what? For stopping. That day, for every day since. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone soft in the particular way it only did when he meant something completely, without any performance left in it at all. Thank you for being someone worth stopping for. I didn't know, before you, that protecting someone could feel like this. Like something I wanted, instead of something I owed the universe as payment for a debt I could never actually settle. You didn't just give me someone to protect, Jason. You gave me a reason to believe I deserve to be protected too, eventually, by someone. I didn't expect that to be you. I'm endlessly glad it was. I didn't have words good enough for a response like that, so I didn't try to find any. I just held on, in that same stairwell where everything had started, and let the quiet say what needed saying. I think about the stairwell often, even now, months later, with the school year stretching comfortably ahead of us and the memory of that first rainy day softened into something almost sweet instead of frightening. I think about how close I came to walking past him, without ever understanding what waited beneath the reputation everyone warned me about. I think about how easily fear can disguise the exact thing it's protecting. Raphael still waits by the gate most days, though now it's less about escorting me safely home, and more about simply wanting the extra 20 minutes together before the day fully ends. He still goes quiet and intent whenever someone new gets shoved or mocked in a hallway, still moves to intervene before conscious thought even catches up. Some habits born from grief don't fully disappear, and I've stopped wanting them to because that instinct is inseparable from the person I love. Sometimes, late at night, when we're sitting together on that same rooftop where he first told me about the friend he lost, I ask him if he still worries about being too late. Every day, he admits, honest in the way he's learned to be with me. But it's different now. It used to feel like a wound I was constantly bracing to reopen. Now it just feels like something I carry, quietly, while I get to have this. This. Meaning me, meaning us, meaning the quiet, ordinary, hard-won normalcy of 2 people who found each other in the middle of a rainstorm and refused to let go afterward. I used to think love, if it ever found me, would look like something soft and simple, something without complication. I didn't expect it to arrive wearing someone else's fear like armor, someone the whole school flinched away from, someone whose gentleness had been mistaken for danger by everyone who'd never bothered to look past the surface. But that's exactly what I got. A boy who stopped every fight the moment someone looked at me wrong, not because he wanted to be feared, but because somewhere underneath all that reputation was a person who had already lost someone once and had decided quietly and without ever asking for credit that he would not lose anyone like that again. I was lucky enough to be the one he decided to keep, and every single day since that rainy stairwell morning I've been grateful. Not for the reputation, not for the fear he carries or the fights he still occasionally finds himself in, but for the boy underneath all of it, the one who held my face like something precious on a bench under a flickering street lamp and told me plainly and without armor that he loved me. That's the story people don't know when they whisper his name in the hallways, like a warning. They see the delinquent. I got to know the person keeping watch underneath the one who never once, not from the very first day, let anyone look at me wrong without answering for it, and who in the process taught me what it actually feels like to be safe and seen and loved all at once. I wouldn't trade that stairwell for anything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.